It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Burlington Police Chief John Murad leaves his post in the next few weeks. He joined the department in 2018 and has been chief since 2020. He was with the NYPD for almost 12 years before that. Murad is stepping aside because he and progressive Mayor Emma Mulvaney-Stanak have different views on policing, which he outlines in this edition of 802 News. South Burlington Police Chief Sean Burke will serve as interim chief until a new permanent leader is found. Murad discussed some of the challenges the new chief will face, including the lingering effects of a major reduction in officers after city leaders cut the force in 2020. We begin our discussion after a word from our sponsor, Red Hen Baking Company. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. So you're leaving next month. Mixed feelings?
Mixed feelings in the sense of the fact that I do love this department and this city and the people who are inside this agency. I have been tremendously privileged to get to work with them. I've thought that every single day was an honor. And we've done a lot of really important things together. We have seen us through a crisis that we're really still in with regard to staffing. And we have also, at the same time, built a lot of new capacities, both to address that staffing crisis, but also to further the agency and augment what we do, irrespective of whether or not sworn officer staffing were where we wanted it to be. And where we want it to be would be, I would want this agency to be, once again, staffed at 105, authorized, with routine numbers in the high 90s. That is a functional and effective agency for the city of Burlington, given our city's size, the number of people that we serve, and the kinds of things that our populace wants us to do. And we're not there. We're at 63 right now instead of the high 90s. That is not an effective number. But we have built these other capacities in an attempt both to address that staffing deficit and just to do better work. To address the staffing deficit, we have increased the number of community service officers we have, or CSOs. They are unarmed, they are unsworn, they cannot make arrests, they cannot demand things of people or take people into custody, but they can issue municipal tickets, and they can project a certain amount of public safety presence in the sense of saying the city is here, and there are people that you can call. They go to non-injury crashes, they can do noise complaints, they can deal with animals. That is helpful, but it is not a replacement for police. We have also created something called the Community Support Liaison, or CSL. The CSLs are in-house social workers, and they deal with the issues that are really a challenge for Burlington right now, a challenge for many cities across the country, but we feel it here in a very pronounced way. Those challenges are substance use disorder and the incredible increase that we've seen with regard to overdose in public. We've seen with regard to the kinds of drugs that are out in the system right now. Also, mental health issues, particularly chronic mental health issues, as opposed to crisis. So a crisis would be when an individual actually sort of decompensates and has a moment that oftentimes involves a lot of personal risk to the person and to people around that person. We're talking more along the lines of chronic mental health issues, people who become real challenges for their neighbors because they are constantly getting into property issue disputes. They have issues around whether or not they can function and interact with people in healthy ways. And then last but definitely not least in the city of Burlington, homelessness. We have more people who are unhoused in our community than we have ever had that we know of in recorded time. Who knows? I suppose back in the 30s when there were Hoovervilles around the country, we probably experienced something like that in Burlington, but we certainly don't have any living memory of it. What we know is that right now we have more unhoused people than we've had in living memory, and they often have overlap with those two other issues I mentioned, which include substance use disorder and having mental health crises or chronic mental health issues. The community support liaisons, or the CSLs, address those, and they address them really well. And we would need those roles and what they are currently doing for us, irrespective of whether or not we had 63 police officers sworn or 97 police officers sworn. I'm really proud of having co-created that capacity with a woman named Lacey Smith, who's the assistant director of CAPE. CAPE is Crisis Advocacy Intervention Programs, and it's something we built here in the department. So those are the kinds of things that make me sad to leave. I think there's a lot more to do with the police department. I am eager to see this agency reconnect with people. It has been challenging to be as connective with regard to the community as we want to be, as our community wants us to be, when our officers are overburdened. They are constantly going from call for service to call for service, and the notion of being able to pull away from the demands of the radio and connect with people is circumscribed when we are staffed the way that we are. But I do think that there is the possibility of reconnection on the horizon. I think there are things we can do. The Queen City Police Foundation has some great ideas that may come to fruition this summer for community connective events, and I would love to be there. I'm sad that I won't be there in the capacity as chief, but the mayor and I have different ideas about how to achieve public safety. She deserves to find somebody who will align with her ideas on public safety. I'm really excited and grateful for incoming interim chief Sean Burke, who knows this agency very, very well and is a tremendous police leader, and I think is going to be somebody who helps us move forward and also restabilize and perhaps sort of take a new foot, maybe make a flying lead change and to use an old horsing term, and get ourselves back into a position where we can address all the things that we have as a city to address.
I think there was a collective sigh of relief at that announcement.
I think so too.
In terms of staffing levels, there's been a lot of talk about the 2020 vote by the city council. One of the things that really struck me was fairly recently you were talking to the city council talking about recruitment. Mm-hmm. It floored me how few people apply for jobs now when there's an opening compared in the past. Yeah. Why is that happening?
Well, I said in a very long report to the city council that the city council requested back in September of 2024, and I gave it to them in December of 2024, but it was presented in early January of 2025 this year. That report is 60-something pages long and goes into a great deal of detail about what I think is happening with regard to recruitment. The short answer is that there is something that the country is experiencing, and then there is something that Burlington is experiencing. And Burlington's experience does go back to that 2020 vote. I think that 2020 vote, it was a tremendously bad vote for the city of Burlington and a very bad vote for the Burlington Police Department. It told the officers who were here that they were not wanted, and they left in droves because of that sense of not being wanted. And these were men and women who had dedicated their careers to an agency that they saw and that objectively was forward-thinking, compassionate, very progressive with lowercase p, in the sense of saying we want to be a better agency every single day. We had embraced a lot of things either early compared to the rest of the state or first compared to the rest of the state, from body cameras to cultural competency training to very delineated rules around fair and impartial policing. These were things that we did and had a great deal of pride in, and I think that vote really told officers here that that sacrifice and the things you've done are not appreciated. They said so in their exit interviews. Officers who left were incredibly clear that they were leaving because of the city, not the agency, not the leadership, but the city and the way they felt appreciated or lacked that sense of appreciation. The people who are here are a little different, I think. I think the people who are here, obviously, whatever lack of appreciation they felt wasn't sufficient to make them leave. They stuck it out. And now we have other issues. We are dealing with a sense of overwork. We are dealing with a facility that needs renewal, either needs an overhaul or a wrecking ball. And so I think that what Burlington is facing is the fact that it is difficult for the people who are in Burlington to be honest ambassadors to anyone who wants to come here when they ask things like, are you treated fairly? Yes and no. Do you feel supported by the community? Not as much as we once did. Do you have a lot of time to have to yourself, for example? Is there a strong work-life balance? Not the way there used to be. We are overworked. We get great training here. That's one thing that the officers are very clear on. We get a lot of training. They get the training that they want or need. We could always have more. Cops love training. They get a lot of that compared to some of our neighboring agencies. If you want to be an officer who is active all the time, we have that here. We are a very active agency. By volume and by variety, these officers do more and see more than any police officers in the state. And that goes for, obviously, the one larger agency in the state, the Vermont State Police. We have a larger variety of calls for service, and they are urban calls for service. This is a city. There are many ways in which Burlington at 45,000 people is not a big city, but it is a big city in the ways that matter to police. And we have a lot of different calls for service. You want that? This is an incredible place to come. If you want only to babysit a highway, or if you want a very slow rural police department kind of feel, this is not the agency to come to. If you want to feel really connected to your community, right now, the external sense is that that's not the case. I dispute that. I think that these men and women go out and they connect with the community every single day. They are stressed by the fact that they encounter the same people far too often, that they encounter a sense of Groundhog Day with regard to arresting somebody, seeing that person released before you are finished with your paperwork, and then encountering the person again tomorrow, doing the exact same thing, and then you begin the same process. That is a frustration. That can contribute to a certain amount of work satisfaction for officers. The community is supportive, and when officers have an occasion to actually interact with the community, such as big events, the incredible parade that was had in January for the UVM men's soccer team. What a great day that was. Things like the 3rd of July or the Vermont City Marathon, or the tree lighting, the holiday tree lighting in late November on the marketplace. These are opportunities for officers to interact with people and have people express their appreciation for them and be reminded, the officers, that they are wanted by this city. They're definitely needed by this city. But they don't get the chance to really encounter that kind of sentiment very often when they are running from call to call, and when more of those calls than ever before per officer are high priority calls. Because when a person is harmed or is having what may very well be one of the worst days of his or her life because their car was stolen, or because they have been victimized in some way, or because they've been hurt, they don't have a lot of time to look and say, I really appreciate you, police officer. That's not what's on their radar at that moment. I get those kinds of calls and letters after the fact. We are able to see that from folks after the fact. But in that moment, that's not something that you are really experiencing. And so the more, I think, compassionate and emotional and just casual connection that can be made is challenging when the pace of the incidents are so fast and so high stakes.
The 2020 vote came after the killing of George Floyd.
Yes.
Do you think that was really it? It sounds what you're saying, that there's something more going on with the community and its view of the police.
Obviously, I think that the terrible murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis was a precipitating event. Of course it was. It caused a reckoning in policing across the country, both with regard to how policing works, with regard to use of force, but also specifically police and race. And that is something that is a fraught topic, a challenging topic. It's one that we have wrestled with for hundreds of years as a people in this continent. And so those things absolutely had something to do with it. But there was also a moment in 2020 where people who are specifically inimical to policing, who are abolitionists at heart, who do not want policing, who do not believe that policing is necessary for a strong community, had their moment to say, we're going to try to press forward at this opportune time, this moment of opportunity for us, and try to make this happen. And in Burlington, they came closer than in almost any city around the country. They really got what they were looking for. And frankly, that viewpoint is insanity. It is insane to think that you cannot have or do not need police in a strong community. I think that the stronger a community is, the less you need policing in the sense of presence or obtrusive policing. And one of my personal heroes with regard to philosophy is Sir Robert Peel, who was the first leader of the Metropolitan Police in England, and in 1829 he is sort of apocryphally said to have created these 9 principles of policing. And the last one talks about the idea that the measure of policing is its efficiency, not its visibility. The idea that it is achieving what it needs to achieve. But it's also one of the previous rules is that the public are the police and the police are the public. We have to be the same. Public safety is a shared responsibility. We're all in it together, and we have to do the work together. That said, if you don't have people doing that work who are dedicated to it, you are not going to be able to have the things that we expect of a free society. Our Constitution promises, a number of things. It talks about justice. It talks about the general welfare. It talks about the idea that we are free to exercise a variety of rights, and it talks about these things that are promised by the Constitution. But if they are not underpinned by an entity that can impartially and fairly and effectively and competently make certain that everyone has access to those promises, that it can't fulfill them.
You mentioned earlier your incompatibility, I think was the word you used in describing your relationship with the mayor.
I don't think I said incompatible. I think I said we just our ideas are a little different. So maybe I said incompatible, but certainly our approach is different.
And why do you think that is?
I think that we have different ideas about how to think about things like homelessness around substance use disorder, and I think there are honest disagreements in that sphere among a lot of folks. I think that in general, there are folks who believe that harm reduction essentially means zero consequence for people who are in the throes of substance use disorder. That because of the nature of substance use disorder, you are not really responsible for the things you are doing, and treatment is the option in front of you. And I believe that treatment is an important part, but I also believe that there is consequence, and I believe that there has to be an opportunity to give that person treatment. And that treatment sometimes is best served in jail, in a place where the person, depending on the acts that the person has committed, the behaviors that the person has exhibited, is removed from the community to keep the community safer and to keep the individual safer, and to give that individual the opportunity to address what may be underlying factors for the behavior. But the behavior is there in and of itself. We can't have people who are, for example, using drugs in public. We can't cede our shared public spaces to people who behave in ways that are unlawful and largely incompatible, to use the term in a different way, with what our public mores are and what our laws are.
You mentioned there's a smaller number of people committing the larger number of crimes. I've seen a figure that you cited at one point that 80% of the crime is being caused by small number of people?
Yeah, 80% is generally 20% or so are probably responsible for about 80. I know for a fact that our top 10% are responsible for a third of our crimes. And I put out a year-end report, a preliminary year-end report. It's available on the website that talks a lot about that and where people are with regard to how much crime they're committing and what our rates of recidivism are. The rates of recidivism are worse than they have ever been. If you look at the last several years, back in 2019, 72% of our arrestees were arrested once. And then they didn't get arrested again, at least not in that calendar year. Getting arrested kind of stinks and it's no fun. So most people, one is enough. But in 2024, it was 62% of folks who were arrested only once. And that 10% difference means that there is a large group of folks who are getting arrested multiple times, larger than it's ever been in recent memory. And at the bottom sliver, you have people who are getting arrested more than 10 times. And individuals getting arrested more than 10 times in a year without any carceral consequence, and that's just a fancy way of saying jail, is not working out for us as a community. We as a society, as a state, have for 30 plus years really prioritized the idea of not taking people into custody. We have a number of laws, we have a number of legislative movements that have created law and then been reinforced by courts that say we do everything we can not to jail people, particularly if there hasn't been any direct violence in their behavior. But we need to reassess what violence is when people's actions can cause tremendous harm to a community, even if they have not directly harmed a specific individual. That has to be addressed. And I believe that what's really needed is some sort of groundswell of public opinion about that. And if the greater measure of our community disagrees with what I'm saying, so be it. But I don't believe that's the case. And I think that what we haven't had yet is a catch-up of our laws, a reconciliation of our laws to the current situation that we are in, and what I think most people in our community want, which is a better way to address the harmful behaviors that we are seeing, even if they are not directly violent to someone, even if they are not felonious. These are criminal behaviors that are harmful to the community. They're committed by the same individuals again and again and again. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Arresting the same person 5 times in a month and expecting a different result is not working out for us as a community right now.
Okay, at the same time, and I know you've had concerns about the Chittenden County State's Attorney, Sarah George, she won re-election by an overwhelming margin.
Yeah, I don't know that what I'm describing is necessarily attributable to the state's attorney alone, and you're correct. She was elected by a tremendous margin. This is there's a perfect storm of situation here, which is, as I said, 30, 40, 50 years of law, court closures that have created tremendous backlogs in our court system, where the logical decision it would be to triage the cases and only take the most serious cases, as opposed to piles and piles of relatively low-level cases, trespass and open-air drug use and retail theft and acts of disorderly conduct that are frightening for people but did not cause anybody any physical harm. Yeah, I would triage those cases too and say, well, I can't really deal with those at this moment when I know that I also have, for example, what we're now finally dealing with from, say, 2022, where we had 5 murders in the city of Burlington, right. A number we had never seen before as a city, where we had 26 gunfire incidents, many of which were assaults, 4 of which were among those 5 murders. Those are big cases that need to be addressed. And if I am forced to choose between those two, I would choose the big case over the other. I have done so myself with regard to the priority response plan that I created for the police department. And to recognize that when I have a robbery call for service, the retail theft is not a call for service that officers are going to go to if they are tied up on a robbery call. And so I can understand that kind of triaging. We're in a perfect storm where we are triaging that far more often than we wish we were because of those court backlogs caused by the pandemic, but also by keeping the court closed longer perhaps than it should have been, certainly longer than the state was closed. The governor ended his rules around COVID much earlier than the courts did. We are dealing with those many, many years, those decades of legal decisions, of legislative decisions around whether or not we hold people or how we incarcerate. We are dealing with the loss of our custodial mental health care capacity. The idea of being able to hold people who have mental health care issues was largely obliterated by Irene. Tropical Storm Irene was 15 years ago now. We are dealing with that, and then we are dealing with the fact that there are fewer police than we would want there to be, definitely in Burlington, but in other parts of the state and the county too, to be able to address these behaviors that we see. All of this stuff swirls together into the situation that we see in front of us, then exacerbated by, as I mentioned, more people unhoused than we've ever seen. Being homeless is not a crime, but people who are unhoused do tend to find themselves in criminal situations more often than people who are housed. The fact that we have so many more people who are unhoused means that the attendant criminality that is associated with it is going to increase. So we're seeing a lot of these things at the same time. What do we do to get out of it? Well, either we nibble around the edges, or we pick one or two of these things and try to address them, or we just try to say, is there one thing that we could do that would make a big difference? Certainly from a police officer's perspective, with regard to the work that police officers do, having a consequence at the end of an encounter would be a first step, and an important one.
You know, it's fascinating listening to you talk about this. You worked for the New York Police Department for 12 years. You rose to the level of assistant commissioner under Bill Bratton, who was really a big proponent of the broken windows theory.
Yeah.
And we're talking about problems here in Burlington that are a hell of a lot bigger than broken windows and graffiti.
Yes and no. So many of our issues are, in fact, of the broken windows variety, quality of life issues. When you have a recidivist who is trespassing and committing burglary, but not the kind of organized burglary that involves going into people's homes and stealing things purposefully, acts of trespass, acts of retail theft,
car break-ins,
and the idea of being out in the public sphere in conditions that are not conducive to other people wanting to be in the public sphere with them. So why do so many people say that they won't come to Burlington anymore? Because of these open public behaviors. Those are quality of life issues. Those are by definition quality of life issues. What we saw in 2020 here in Burlington was the so-called big stuff. We saw an incredible spike in gun violence. We saw those 5 murders. We saw a very different kind of situation. And our detective bureau and our patrol resources did amazing work addressing that, which is why it declined in 2023 and into 2024. And we are seeing those declines. I'm going to knock on wood. Hope it doesn't make too much sound in there. We're seeing those declines in 2025 as well still. But what we see now we see the things that Commissioner Bratton did talk about with regard to broken windows. The notion of broken windows from an article in The Atlantic back in, I think, 1982 by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, was that you stop the small stuff before it becomes the big stuff.
Right.
Now, when the big stuff happens, you got to address the big stuff. You can't just say, well, I'm not going to pay attention to that because I'm only dealing with the broken windows. That's foolish and doesn't make sense. 2022, we dealt with the things that we had to deal with. And now we are in a position where we do have these broken windows kinds of issues that we want to address. And we are having a challenge in doing so, both because of staffing and the ability to respond, and because of what comes next. When Commissioner Bratton took over as the head of the Transit Police Department in the very early 90s, and he did that before taking over the NYPD in 1994. When he took over Transit, he implemented a decision to say, look, we know that everyone who is committing violence in the transit department, in the transit system, is also jumping the turnstiles.
Right.
Now, lots of people were jumping turnstiles because at a certain point, if you see everyone jump the turnstiles and see no consequence, you're going to do it too. That means that if everybody jumping them, was everyone jumping the turnstile a criminal? Well, they committed the crime of theft of service by jumping the turnstile. Were they criminals in other ways? Probably not. But was every criminal also a turnstile jumper? The answer was yes. Everyone who was in the system who was committing real crimes around sex assaults, around pickpocket at work, around muggings, and around more serious violence had also jumped the turnstile to get in. By suddenly making every turnstile an opportunity to find somebody and arrest people, and doing large-scale arrests at turnstiles, and then processing them immediately. He created these they called them bust buses, where they'd park a bus upstairs from the transit point, and they would arrest and then immediately take you to the bus, rather than having to then get on a train. Ironically, you get them from a person for jumping the turnstile, then you actually get on a train and take them to a station, or you waiting for a car to come get you at that stop and then take them to a police station. Instead, they did the processing in these buses. Right upstairs, and they could move lots of people through. But those people also went to jail that day. And if you go to jail, you are not going to jump the turnstiles again if that was your only kind of crime. Now, if you are a person whose lifestyle is, in fact, a criminal one, that's how you make your money, you are a thief, you are a mugger, one is probably not going to do it. But then you also start to find people with guns, people who were carrying unlawful weapons, people who had other kinds of contraband on them. That was an effect of that. That's why it worked in New York. And New York and Burlington are not the same. We don't have a large-scale public transit system in the same way that New York does. I am not advocating for us to go do that kind of work. Okay, but although our downtown transit center does have a locus of disorder.
And we have a city hall where you talk about this idea of open-air drug use.
Sure.
So should the strategy be, I'm trying to sort of bring the analogy of the broken windows back closer to home here.
Sure.
Do you arrest everybody using drugs in a place like City Hall Park to try to create that climate where people feel less threatened? Is that the idea?
Right now.
And I guess how do you do that, given the problem you also described earlier with the packed courts? A state's attorney's got to prioritize.
Correct. Those are really good questions. I think that there has to be a sense of shared direction and strategy on something like this. Which ones are we going to prioritize? But right now, there is a distinct sense that arresting a person merely for either using or possessing drugs is not a priority for our state system. It is because, in some level, there is a consensus that person is, in fact, not a criminal, but is, in fact, a victim of his or her substance use disorder. And yet, there is a externality, which is the impact that it has on the community when it's done in public in that way. Is treatment the best option? Sure. Are there treatment avenues available? Not so much. Is jail an opportunity in the meantime for something like that? I would suggest yes. I would suggest that with regard to people whose behaviors are criminal, not their condition, that are causing repeat issues for our public and making our public spaces less inviting for everyone else, who are harming other people, particularly, obviously, if there's physical harm involved, but also if there is just the threat of harm and, again, that sense that we can't share the public world the way we all want to. I would suggest that while a mental health option or a behavioral health option or a drug treatment option are the best options for those folks, and I would prefer them, all things being equal, those are not available to us at the moment. And we have an option that is available that we are not using with any kind of frequency. And again, I am not talking about for somebody who does this once. I'm not talking about an individual who marijuana is no longer unlawful to possess, but it is still unlawful to smoke in public. Somebody smoking a joint in City Hall Park should not go to jail. The notion of being unhoused and drinking in public and being boisterous and needing to be addressed by police saying, knock it off, you're trespassed from the park for a day, that person doesn't need to go to jail. But someone who has, as the case is, the person with the most arrests in 2024 had 46 arrests in 2024 and 114 police encounters total. That's every 3 days there's a police encounter. That's an arrest every week. The next person had 30 and 187 police encounters. Individuals like that are causing a tremendously disproportionate amount of harm in the community. And we need to think about what we're going to do. And there needs to be some kind of community groundswell to talk about what it is that we as a people want, so that we can express that to our legislators, so that we can express that to the courts. And then, obviously, all of this has to be balanced to be lawful. It has to be in keeping with people's rights. It has to be in keeping with the Constitution. But there are also opportunities for us to say, how are we going to do things that ultimately can be helpful to those people? I know the individuals in both those cases that I just mentioned, the top one and the number 1 and number 2 of 2024, neither of those persons is well suited or well served by being out and living in the way that they live and the parlous kind of conditions in life that they live. We're not doing them favors in prioritizing their freedom over everybody else's general welfare.
Is the obstacle, the reason that they're out, is the obstacle lack of resources, the view of the state's attorney, the view of the community at large that you talked about earlier, or something else?
I think yes. It's all those things. As I said, there's a swirl of things that we have in front of us, but we won't be able to cut through that swirl if we don't have a clear sense of what the people want us to do.
And when you talk about this, you recently were talking about this and were basically muzzled. That's got to be frustrating.
Yeah, I think muzzled is a strong term.
Too strong?
The mayor has asked that when we put out press releases, we put them through her office first. So I think that's in keeping with the mayoral prerogative, and we are obeying that executive order. I think we had I know we had a department directive that described how we make press releases. It's a little out of date. It's old, that's for sure. It was signed by former Chief Sherling, so that was a couple chiefs ago. But other than one mention of a technology that we don't use anymore, a platform that doesn't really exist as an independent platform anymore, the rest of it was, I think, good policy. That is also in keeping with, and there is also, of course, our HR policy that talks about the city of Burlington and the notion of routine press releases being able to be approved by department heads. But if the mayor's office wants additional insight into those, that's the mayor's prerogative. So we're doing that.
You had no problem with that?
It is an extra step, but it affects our public information officer, our PIO, more than it affects me. I don't do most of our press releases anymore.
Okay, but this did seem, at least, to come in reaction to comments that you were making about what I would maybe overgeneralize as kind of the catch and release that was going on with some of the people that you've mentioned earlier.
There was one comment that I made immediately before that executive order around a specific individual and what I felt was a tremendously egregious history of recidivism and a belief that I thought there were opportunities, if this individual were convicted, to address that recidivism. I didn't mention anything about the specific case at hand, and I did not in any way call for a certain outcome. I suggested that if there were a conviction, that we could explore some options.
Okay, but those two events would lead me, and I think people in the public, to say there was a cause and effect there.
Yeah, I think that some people might be led towards that. Okay.
And you didn't have a problem with that?
There are lots of things that I do as a chief or as an employee of the city, and that we work forward with the rules that we've got.
I want to go back to you mentioning I think it was almost a philosopher, maybe in the 1800s. Obviously, somebody of highly educated, went to Harvard University, and then went back and also got a master's degree. What I really wanted to get to, though, is you gave this 6-minute speech to the graduates back 2013.
Yes.
I got there. Okay. There were 2 lines in there that I wanted to ask you about. The first one was, the lives you envision are not necessarily the ones you lead, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Do you think that's been your experience?
Oh, well, certainly compared to, I was in that moment speaking, so this was the Harvard University commencement in 2013, and therefore it was not only the undergraduates, it was also all the graduate schools. And I was the graduate speaker. There was also an undergraduate speaker, and then Harvard being Harvard, there was a Latin speaker. So one person delivers a speech in Latin. I was the graduate speaker. It was a great honor to be able to give that speech. That line was really delivered to the undergraduates who were sitting there, although they were undergraduates for only a few minutes more since they were sitting at commencement. I think that many people who are on commencement day from college, any college, but perhaps particularly so from a place like Harvard, are thinking that there are lives of incredible consequence and incredible sort of glamour or importance in front of them. And
Or money.
A great deal of money.
You mentioned that.
I mentioned that in that speech as well. And I wanted to make certain that they recognize that that's not going to be, it's not going to work out that way for all of them, right? And it has not worked out that way for me. I did not turn into the famous, wealthy, influential person that I thought I might become. But what has happened is wonderful. I have very few regrets in my life. I'm very happy with where I am and what I've been able to accomplish, the things I've been able to do. I feel incredibly fortunate and lucky. And I think that's what I was just trying to say to them. The idea that they may not end up on Wikipedia pages, but they can make real impacts in their communities. I think that we're surrounded by, there's so many people that, and each of us can imagine somebody in our own lives who is not on a Wikipedia page or who does not have a great following or a job that screams, I'm important, or the trappings of some kind of grand life, and yet is incredibly meaningful and important and makes these ripples that affect lots of other people. I mean, it goes back to something as silly as It's a Wonderful Life and the idea that, who's the richest man in town? It's not Mr. Potter, it's George Bailey. And the idea that you've made all these connections and affected so many people in so many ways. I am incredibly blessed to have had a number of different positions where I feel like I've been able to make that kind of impact and to make things better as far as I can and what I see. Sometimes we all disagree about what better is or better isn't. Those abolitionists I mentioned in 2020 probably think that that's not the case at all. Nothing I've done over the past 5 years has been in their mind that. But I think it has. And I'm proud of what I've been able to do here and more importantly, what the men and women who I have tried to support and give the tools they need to do their work have been able to do here.
The other line you mentioned that I wanted to bring up was success doesn't mean rising to the top. It's about changing the world. Do you think you've changed the world?
I think all of us change the world. I say so in that speech. I think everybody changes the world a little bit, sometimes badly, sometimes in ways that people don't want. But we all change the world in the sense that we are all in this together, and none of us operates completely independently. None of us is a self-made person in the sense that your great accomplishments are yours and yours alone. And to a certain extent, nobody's failures affect only you. On some level, when you mess something up, it probably affected other people in some way or other, or has the potential to do that. I think that we all if we know that we all change the world to usually much lesser degrees, but also sometimes to greater degrees, I think it makes us more cognizant of our debt to each other. The person who says, I'm not my brother's keeper, was the bad guy in that situation. We are our brother's keepers. We are each other's backstops and supports. And we're also sometimes each other's problems. And so if we keep that in mind and know that, I think it makes for a more functional society. We are, as a species, we are groups. We are a herd species. We have to be together. And the exceptions only prove the rule. You can find me some hermit or some person who lived all alone, some Jeremiah Johnson kind of character who's out there all by himself. You can find them, but they are exceptions to the rule. We exist together. We must exist together. And again, I think that you have to exist together with rules and with order and a sense of everybody playing by the same guidelines. And police are integral to that. So I'm very happy that I found this profession. I found it late in life. I was in my 30s when I became a cop. It was after a lot of different things that had happened. I had tried for a bit to be famous, the sort of fame and grandeur that I thought I would have after college. Tried that for about a decade, didn't. 9/11 woke me up.
What was that?
Oh, I went out to California to be famous. Lived in Los Angeles for a number of years. Wrote some, acted some. And 9/11 made me decide that I was living a sort of unexamined life, to quote the philosopher. I just wasn't contributory. I think that you can contribute great things through art. I wasn't. I was doing little commercials and things here and there. But I, after 9/11, wanted to contribute in a different way. I wanted to know how I could make things better.
And how did that translate into working for the police?
Well, it was a long path. I went. So 9/11 coincided also with a TV miniseries about World War II and the men who were fighting in that war and these incredible things that ordinary people had accomplished. And I kind of wanted to know if I had it in me to accomplish those things as well. Simultaneously, I also got back together with my college girlfriend. We'd been apart for several years, and I moved to New York to be with her. I took a job at Newsweek magazine. I worked at Newsweek briefly, wasn't a great reporter, and then read a book, actually read an article by Malcolm Gladwell about Myers-Briggs tests. And the notion of, is there a test that can tell you who you are, or do you actually have to go to experience life to know who you are?
Wrote a lot about the tipping point, too.
Yes, he did. And the tipping point was his first big book, and that book was from an article that had to do a lot with what Bill Bratton had accomplished in New York City in the early 90s. Nevertheless, this article was about a man, it was about these tests. Can you give a personality test and understand who somebody is? And Gladwell's answer was no, and I sort of saw that and said, yeah, I'd like to know who I am and what I can do. And in conjunction with, do I have it in me what those ordinary men in the 1940s had in them, in conjunction with, can I contribute more than I feel like I'm contributing now after 9/11? And Newsweek was the first opportunity at that. Also, at the same time, getting back together with a woman I loved and saying, okay, now I need to also provide and be somebody who's going to be an equal partner in this relationship.
Not in media. Yep.
And it wasn't going to happen at Newsweek. And so I joined the NYPD. I had read a book by a guy who'd gone to Harvard and had joined, and that sort of disabused me of what I'm ashamed to say was a sense that I would somehow be wasting that degree and all the effort that my parents and others had put into helping me get to that school if I went to the NYPD. And it wasn't a waste at all. I think that we need more people who have that kind of educational arc to go into public service. I loved it. I was immediately just entranced by the men and women who were doing it and the reasons that they had for doing it. And then I was entranced by the work. I went to work in the Bronx in public housing, and I worked first as a beat cop, and then I ended up as a field intelligence officer doing a lot of narcotics interdiction and search warrants. And then somebody found out that I had an anomalous educational background, and they dragged me down to One Police Plaza, which is headquarters in New York, and I became a detective on a special projects team doing a lot of special projects. Invented a new way of tracking and publicizing officer-involved shootings, and investigated or analyzed more than 500 over the course of about 4 or 5 years. Also did crazy things that were one-offs that only a department as large as the NYPD can do. We created a program that sent police officers to Haiti to try to help there after the huge earthquake that happened. We did programs around vice operations and around how we were as a department, the NYPD, how it was dealing with a number of different issues, including a lot of counterterrorism things. And then I went to grad school on the NYPD's dime and was able to give that speech, as I mentioned. Incredible experience at grad school. Was at the finish line 10 feet, 15 feet from the first bomb of the Boston Marathon that year. and participated in sort of the response and cleaning and trying to help the injured. And then went back to the NYPD, was a sergeant in the 3-4 precinct, which is the northernmost precinct in Manhattan, which is where, ironically, my mom and her family, her family's Cuban, and my mom's Cuban, but her Cuban family had lived up in Washington Heights. So being a cop there was sort of like going home. It was great. And then kind of got dragged down to One Police Plaza again when Bill Bratton came in, because I had contributed to a white paper that he ended up using to really structure the changes he wanted to make during his second tenure as police commissioner. He'd been the police commissioner in 94 through 96 under Giuliani. He'd really turned the city around, but he and Giuliani didn't see public safety the same way. And so he left, and then he came back in 2014, he was announced.
After being in L.A.
After being in L.A. for several years and having really changed that department a lot and successfully made that department a stronger, fairer department. He came back to New York, and we had a very heady 2.5 years of great pace and change. And I was privileged to get to be elevated to an assistant commissioner spot and work very closely with him.
2018, you come back here. Why?
So then Chief Brandon Del Pozo advertised externally for a deputy chief. That's not a common thing. Most of the time, deputy chiefs are promoted internally. We currently are actually advertising externally for deputy chiefs just because of where we are staffing-wise. But it was unusual in 2018. He did so, and I saw an opportunity to go back to public service, which I had wanted to do for a while. Even when I initially took the job with Commissioner Bratton, it was with the understanding that I was going to try to get some experience that would help me make up for the experience I'd missed with that great rank leap, and sort of burnish my resume a bit with the idea of going back to public service eventually. I think there's tremendous value in public service. And so this was an opportunity to not only get that, but also to come back to my home. I was born here in Burlington. My parents both still live out in Underhill. They were both professors. My mom was a lecturer, but Dad was a professor at UVM. He worked there 35 years. She was there for about 25 years. Burlington is where we would go when we wanted to see movies. If we went to, Merrill's, Merrill's 5, or in South Burlington, or coming into town and doing things. This was my city. And so the idea of getting to come home, to be closer to my parents, my wife and I, every time we would come to Vermont for Thanksgiving or Christmas or summertime, the Champlain Valley Fair, the kids loved going to the fair when we were still living in New York City. We would look at each other as we started to drive back to the city and say, how do we actually live here? And we never had a real answer until this opportunity came. And so I was incredibly grateful for the opportunity and being selected to be the deputy chief. And that first year and a couple months of being a deputy chief was one of the best years of my life with regard to work-life balance. It was awesome.
That says something about what happened after you got named chief.
Yeah, that was different. So,
what do you? And I'm not going to ask you if you recommend or don't recommend your parents come downtown. There's no movie theater really left. But when people say they're afraid to go downtown, what's your reaction to that?
My reaction is a wince, an existential wince, and a wish that it were not so. And I try to tell them that it isn't so in many ways. My parents do come downtown. My parents come to Burlington whenever they want, and they are 80. My son is 16. He goes to BHS and he walks around Burlington, and I have no issue with that. My daughter is 13, and she does a lot of shows at the Flynn. And, in between, if there's a matinee day, in between matinee and evening, you got to go get food, go to Church Street and get food. I do not believe this is a dangerous, problematic, or city that is unsafe. I understand why people feel that it is, though, and I know that there are social conditions that are far more prevalent now than they have been in many years, and we see a lot of disorder. Is that disorder unsafe? we don't see signs of that with any great frequency. But I also can't ignore the fact that, for example, a man minding his own business walking down the street was cold-cocked by a person who had no reason to do it.
And quite elderly.
He was quite elderly.
Yeah.
And so
you had a police officer who was basically attacked at the corner of Church and Main.
Yes. And also a police officer attacked in our vestibule. So these things do happen. In both those two instances, it was because the person was a police officer that the person was attacked. These things are not unheard of, and therefore I am not in a position to say it never happens, and you're silly for feeling concerned, person who has expressed a desire not to come to Burlington anymore. But I do think that some of it is is about how we feel as opposed to where we are. That said, I began this but in the midst of this conversation, I've talked about the idea that we have a obligation to our community, and not just to individuals who are harmed, but to the community when it's harmed. And what can we do to try to make the community safer and stronger and feel better? And there is an element there too. And so, there is a disconnect between the notion that, yes, I do believe that you are individually safe to walk around Burlington. I think the likelihood of something happening to you is infinitesimal and you can enjoy your day. Is it better when tons of people are there? Nothing happened on the day of the parade, for example, for the UVM soccer team. A big event like that, or a big event like the tree lighting, it's easier to be in the midst of all that. On any given day, are you going to be harmed walking up and down to Burlington? No. But are you going to see more things that are unpleasant than you perhaps used to? Probably. And are you also going to notice them more now because it's part of sort of our zeitgeist, as it were, or what we're talking about and thinking about a lot? Yeah, probably. So are you going to notice people who are unhoused or appear to be unhoused? Are you going to notice people who appear to be under the influence of substances, whether that's alcohol or drugs? Or might you witness retail theft or somebody running out of a store while clerks are shouting at that person, or not even shouting because they've become inured to it and are just sort of
afraid
saying,
to go after them?
Yes, you may. And those are problems. Those don't make people want to come to a city. But are you unsafe? No. The answer to a lot of these things is to double down on saying we are going to continue to claim this space. We are not going to cede this space to those who use it in ways that make everybody else less likely to use it. But the answer is to try to at least get more things into the town that we can, more events, to express belief that this is still our queen city. It is still the biggest city in our state. It is still the economic driver. It is still the place where there are the best food opportunities and the best nightlife opportunities and the best places to go with regard to some of our great shopping opportunities, great arts opportunities in ways that you don't see in many other places. You can make an evening of this in a way that you can't make an evening even going to something wonderful like the Performance Hall up at Stowe.
I've lived here long enough to remember never having to worry about locking my car. If I didn't remember my apartment key, wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
You don't do that anymore.
No.
But I also hear people say that Burlington was suffering from a case of exceptionalism, that we thought somehow we were immune to all of this, and we're just dealing with and living the reality that everywhere else in America is living. Where do you fall on that scale?
I think both of those things are true. I think that I think not locking your car or your apartment when you live in a city is crazy. And we had a tremendous spike in stolen vehicles in 2022 and 2023 that was largely driven by people
leaving the keys in the car.
Correct. Yeah. Or leaving the car running. To leave your car running out front of a market and run into the market thinking that I'm only going to be in there for a second. You're not. You're going to be in there for 5 minutes. And you leave your car running outside. That said, I also am reluctant to say I don't want to blame that person for doing that, because the person who's responsible is the person who took the car that they didn't own and drove away in it. That's the criminal. That's the person who's done something wrong. But there are reasonable things we can do to make ourselves less likely to be victimized in the world, even while still recognizing that the victimizer is the problem, not the victim. And among those reasonable things are locking your car, not leaving it running, and not leaving your front door wide open when you go for a 10-minute stroll. There are lots of things. Those are issues for us. And yeah, every other community in the country sort of addresses that. There may be, I don't know, maybe Celebration, Florida, where you have this, is somehow immune to these kinds of problems. I doubt it. But New York City is not. And there, too, a lot of the things that we talk about when we say that I don't go to Burlington anymore and I'm concerned about it, Burlington is not New York City or Boston, much less a place like, I think there are some other cities that are suffering even more with regard to public disorder.
But New York got really cleaned up.
It did.
There was a period where it was terrifying to go there. I think a lot of it was that broken window theory. There was a lot, big improvement there.
I think a lot of it was. I think Bill Bratton deserves tremendous credit for turning New York around in the early 90s. And then as his methods were applied around the country, you saw other cities achieve the same kinds of effects.
Yep.
And as you had already mentioned, he did tremendous work in Los Angeles as well. Even today, even no matter where we are, there are a lot of places that have backslid, that are seeing crime numbers that are worse than they have been, but they're nowhere near what they were in the 90s. Nobody is there. Burlington, as I said, actually had more murders in a year than it had, but Burlington's numbers are so small, it's not exactly the example to use.
But
Big
it used
cities
to always be one a year. I mean,
Yeah,
was
true.
Burlington was always one a year.
One or less. I think our actual average is like 0.8 or something.
Yeah.
But that year was pretty terrible. New York is nowhere near where it was in the 90s on any metric. Not its robberies or larcenies or car thefts or murders. And most cities are in the same boat. They are nowhere near where they were at the height of crime in the early 80s through the early 90s. But they are worse than they were in 2019. And many of them are struggling to return to those years immediately before the pandemic. And that makes a difference, too, because it's a little difficult to say to somebody, well, it's not as bad as it was 30 years ago, when we know that it's worse than it was 5 years ago. That rings a bit false.
Right. You do have supporters out there. You even mentioned, some people feel differently about you than others. That's the same, I think, with all of us.
Sure.
I'd like you to respond. One city councilor, Milo Grant, who said about after you announced your departure, I was concerned about unnecessary use of force incidents. I was concerned about a lack of empathy, about the continued lack of adequate community engagement to help repair relationships within the community. I was concerned about no plan to deal with a drug crisis that I saw ballooning exponentially. I felt very, very strongly that every day that you, continued to be the chief of that department was another day that we were further away from fixing things.
So what part of that would you like me to take on? I'm not going to take – I have done my best not ever to mention specific counselors or political figures. That's not my job as a police chief.
Fair.
I'm impartial and I am nonpartisan, and I have never had the names of counselors cross my lips in a way that was specifically – derogatory towards individual counselors.
Okay, I guess I'd be interested to hear what you say about the idea that
never in radio or in public
that we're further away from fixing things.
I believe that over the past 5 years, we have done as much as we can to correct what I said earlier was one of the worst decisions that our council has made. And that we have tried very hard to climb back up a cliff. But it is a lot faster to drop off a cliff than it is to climb back up. And we are not as far as I would have liked us to be. I really thought that I would have ended 2024 with about 72 police officers. And we ended with 63, which was basically back where we were at the beginning of the year. And I was disappointed in that, greatly disappointed. Some of that departure, those were departures I hadn't anticipated. It includes officers who were brand new officers who were just overwhelmed by the workload and didn't think that it was going to be this way. It includes, an officer who, a long-term officer that I didn't expect to depart, and I was sorry to see that officer go. And then, of course, we had retirements, et cetera. I think that we have some retirements coming this year. We have some retirements coming next year. And again, retirements nobody's under an obligation to retire, but when they're eligible to retire at 20, they've been leaving at 20 lately.
And I talked to, as I mentioned, I talked to a couple of your detectives who were going to stay. One specifically said I would plan on staying 25 years. I'm 20 in a day now.
Yep. And that we are seeing that. So I know that we have several retirements anticipated for this year and a couple anticipated for the next calendar year, 2026. But the good news is we don't have any anticipated retirements in 2027. That's not to say we won't lose people. You could lose a 5-year cop who gets a better opportunity, or whose wife is, his wife is a teacher and she gets a job in Virginia. And okay, we're leaving together, right? There's lots of reasons why people might go. But we don't have any known tenure retirements scheduled for 2027. That's a good thing. That's an opportunity for us to potentially only have inflow and not have any outflow, and maybe get some distance back, start climbing that cliff a little bit. 2027 is a little bit away. In the meantime, we need to have some way of having more in than we've had out, and we have not been able to achieve that as well as we wanted. But that said, are we not moving forward as an agency? I began with a relatively long discourse on the community service officers and, more importantly, the community support liaisons and what we're doing there, and the entire CAPE entity, which isn't just the CSLs. CAPE is also, we created something called Burlington Cares, which is mental health crisis. I differentiated before between chronic mental health issues, which are the CSLs, versus mental health crisis, which we have this Burlington Cares team to help us with. We're doing a lot of that kind of work. We have done, I created and implemented 2 years ago a really innovative fair and impartial policing training on the 14th Amendment. And the degree to which the 14th Amendment is incredibly important, and more important than ever in lots of ways right now, as we see. I was horrified to see a representative in Congress at the federal level propose overturning Obergefell, which is underpinned by the 14th Amendment and provides the right for marriage for anyone. I'm concerned about some of the things we're seeing, but we've done training in this place to make our officers and our employees more cognizant of the laws under which we work, the ways in which those laws ensure equality and ensure due process, and also ensure fairness. And I think those are forward movements. We created a new use of force policy here, which we published in July of 2020, in the midst of the great tumult associated with the murder of George Floyd. It was the best policy in the state. I wrote it myself with great assistance from other officers here, including Deputy Chief Matt Sullivan. It came out of work that had been done by a very large community group called the Committee to Review Policing Practices, and it was the best in the state. And essentially, a year and a half later, the state adopted it, but it was based largely on the one that we wrote here in Burlington. We have just created last summer a new department directive around internal complaints and citizen complaints, and how we share those with our independent police commission, so that we ensure that the public has input into our disciplinary processes and has insight into every external citizen complaint that gets made, so that we don't run into issues with, is anything being hidden or anything being ignored. These are forward movements that are incredibly important for an agency that wants to serve its people and wants to make certain that it's doing what I believe police are all about, which is we are here to keep people safe by preventing and responding to crime and disorder with and for our neighbors. And we seek every day to make certain that Burlington is safe and fair everywhere for everyone in the city. And I think we've done a good job of that over the 5 years. We're trying to do it better. We're never satisfied with it. And I'm proud of the work that we've done.
Yet you were also, I think, disappointed, maybe that's not the right word, with the decision to expand this oversight with this commission, with this group that oversees, with more oversight of police discipline.
I was on record as opposing that charter change vote, and that hasn't been implemented yet. It has to go through Montpelier. I am hopeful and I'm optimistic that Montpelier is going to see things differently than the city did, and that it is not going to be approved at the Montpelier level. I do think it's a mistake.
Was that, I mean, again, a cause and effect? That seemed to, your announcement that you weren't going to seek another term seemed to come very soon after that. Was there a
It came
connection?
before. I actually did. I sent my letter to the mayor on November 4th, and the election was in which that decision was made was November 5th.
Okay. So there's no cause and effect there. Couldn't be, right? Because it was before. What's next for you?
I don't know what's next for me yet. I am looking forward to maybe a little bit of time off, a little bit of time away, but I don't know what's next. My wife wishes I were a little bit more certain about what's next. As we've said many times in this conversation, I believe deeply in public service, so I would very much like to stay in public service. Also, as
you're going to run
said,
for political office?
I don't believe politics is in my bailiwick.
Okay. Just checking.
No,
Checking.
I think I'm a little bit. I know what I am good at, and I know the things that are not my bailiwick. I think a lot of political. One of the amazing things about being, I used to watch Mayor Weinberger and just wonder how is he able to sort of get all of these different parts of the city and have them have a clear picture of all these different things, amazing things that were happening around the city in really incredible ways. And to be able to stay on top of all that, and also to be able to work with all the coalitions that are necessary to make any of those pieces happen is impressive.
Okay. You say you love your job. Why leave now?
As I said, I mean, it really does come down to the fact that the mayor and I do have differing ideas on public safety, and she is the mayor. She deserves to find somebody who can do that. I greatly, dearly hope. I think that Interim Chief Burke is going to start this process, and as they search for a new chief, I think the process is only going to be furthered, which is a person who A, does work with the mayor and whose views align with the mayor, but B, someone who can come and say to the men and women of the agency, 2020 happened, but not to me, and we need to move forward together on how we address this. And if where we are right now is where we are for the next 2 years, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to work at this level. By where we are, I mean 63 to 72 officers, as opposed to true forward momentum. True forward momentum is going to come at a great cost. The fact of the matter is that one of the underlying reasons that was publicly stated for the decision to make the police department smaller was the idea of freeing money up to go to other kinds of things. We're going to reduce the police department by 30% so that we can build all these other capacities. Nobody stepped forward and decided to build any of that stuff. The people who were calling for it were unconscionably silent on what to do next. And it was not until I, in December of 2020 and then in January of 2020, presented the Public Safety Continuity Plan that we actually had some ideas about what to do. And occasionally to be told that I didn't embrace any of those things until forced to is very upsetting to me, considering that I did it when nobody else was doing any of these other things. Nevertheless, it didn't save money. And in the long run, we have absolutely spent more money on what we have. And we're going to spend this year, my overtime costs are going to be higher than they should be because we are trying to fill in the work of what really should be 97 police officers with 63. That is not a savings. The idea of the bonuses that we've had to implement, the new salaries we've had to implement in order to make the place attractive again in the wake of officers being told implicitly, we don't want you, to say, no, we do, that's cost us money. None of this has been less expensive. We have spent more and more and more money. And the only way to grow with some sort of lightning that isn't going to be sort of incremental but would be really large, a lurch forward with regard to headcount, would be to spend even more. And we don't have that. We don't. The city doesn't have that money. And I admire Mayor Mulvaney-Stanak a lot for what she's been able to do when faced with these gaps that she's had to address. But that's the way forward. So anybody coming in, whether the interim chief or the next chief, is going to have to look and say, how do we continue to do what we do with what we currently have and grow a little bit at a time until we can really look forward to a year's 2027 being an example where maybe we can make some larger gains, some important larger gains. But we gotta hang on till then. The priority response plan that I created was a way of hanging on. Whoever comes next can probably reevaluate that and determine whether or not it's still the best way or whether it can be tweaked. I think those are good things that are coming for the agency.
You think it's going to be tough to find a new chief, given everything we've talked about?
I think that there are two things that are going to be challenging with regard to a chief search. One is that, as I mentioned, the financial situation for the city is challenging, and not with regard to salary for a chief and saying, that's fine, but to say, hey, chief, what are the resources that you are going to be able to have to do X or Y? When Bill Bratton became the chief of the transit department, it was a separate police department in the early 90s. It had been for decades. They found a massive amount of money in the order of a couple billion, and he got a big chunk of that money to do things for the officers. It sounds silly, but he gave them these commando sweaters, and they loved them, and it made them feel like they always had felt like a second stepchild to the NYPD, also Rands. And now they had these sweaters, and then they also got 9mm pistols when the NYPD still had revolvers, and that was something that made them feel big. The money to do that was because he had money. When he took over the NYPD, there was an influx of officers owing to these things called the burn grants that had been set up under first President George H.W. Bush, but then President Clinton took advantage of it with this upswell in police officers across the country. In New York, it was sort of the political reverse in that it was Mayor Dinkins who had really gotten the ball rolling, but it was Mayor Giuliani who succeeded him who got to sort of grab the glory over these increased headcounts. But the increased headcounts are what made Bill's broken windows efforts that much more possible, and huge numbers and resources. In LA, he got the first expansion of the officer corps. It had always been under just 9,000, little under sometimes in the 8,000s. He got it up to 10,000 for the first time in the city's history, which also was really necessary for them to be able to achieve the gains that they did with regard to crime control. Resourcing is important, and if you have a chief coming in, you need to be able to say, I am going to resource you, and I'm going to give you the things you need to do X and Y and Z. That's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
The other big challenge is that, the environment of our city can be a tough environment. It tends to be very hard on what it considers deviations from orthodoxy, and it is a place that tends to make a lot out of honest mistakes in ways that are not necessarily attractive to somebody who, for example, wants to come here, contribute honestly and positively for 4 or 5 years, but then move on to something else, maybe a little bit bigger. If you feel like you're going to have reputational deficits when you depart that aren't fair, that's going to be a potential obstacle.
You think you have reputational deficiencies as you leave here?
That's up to someone else who decides to Google me to figure out.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.